Okay, evolution. What Darwin was really thinking. That we start out with a joke, a little levity, because that was Darwin there at the end.
No, I just didn't realize that's who that was supposed to be.
Oh yeah, that's supposed to be, that's a picture of Darwin from the side, when he was old. First of all, the Genesis account of creation on the second slide. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the waters teems, and that moves about in it according to their kinds, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the water in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, and the wild animals, each according to their kind. And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Let me start with a prayer, if we could. Father God, I would ask your presence here as we learn about as we learn more about your creation and your hand in creation and the necessity of your hand in creation. Forgive the speaker of his sins, they are many, and bless us all and enlighten us to your glory for the advancement of your kingdom. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Okay, so this is the Genesis account of creation. There's a very interesting repetitive thing. Do you ever read scripture and then after you're done, after you've read it the 20th time, you read it and you go, gee, I didn't know that was there. We'll find out that is the case later on in this account. So, the idea of intelligent design comes from the question of whether we are able or not to detect design when we see it. And the first person that actually talked about this was William Paley, whose picture's on the second page, or no, I guess on the second frame. And he asked if you were walking in the desert or some field somewhere, and you looked down and there was a stopwatch, and you looked down and you picked it up, you could look at that and you could say, this is designed. There's something special about this. This was designed. And so he used that as an argument to look at people and say, my goodness, we are much more complex than a stopwatch. Therefore, we had to be designed. So, the one idea of the random design is that evolution must be random design. So therefore, if you took a bunch of parts from watches, as on the left here, you put them in the shaker, and then randomly shook them up, that there's just a maybe chance that you would get out this nice watch, which is shown here on the right. And do you think that that's possible? It certainly isn't probable. Do you think it's possible? Well, according to Paley, indeed it wasn't. There's other places we can see random design, and this is, design versus randomness. And this is an example which people in intelligent design use all the time. On the left, there's Mount Rushmore. It is clear that was designed, that this was not an act of random erosion and wind and other things. This was designed. How do we know it's designed? Because it looks like Washington and Lincoln and Jefferson and Roosevelt. On the other hand, we see occasionally the picture shown on the right there on Mars. This was from a rover, and all of the Star Trek-y sort of weird people looked at it and says, there's life on Mars, because it looked like a picture of Mars. Or it looked like a picture of a man. Does that look like a picture of a man? But do you think that was designed? No. If you go across Mars and look at all of the different artifacts and all of the different bumps in the landscape and all the different shadows and all the different times of the day, you're going to come up with things that look like random faces. You are. I mean, that's it. So we have an idea of what was designed and what was not. Now, the atheist response, this is Richard Dawkins, our friend. He wrote based on Paley's idea, he wrote a book called The Blind Watchmaker. So, in other words, he was referring to Paley's allegory about finding the watch in a remote field and looking at it and knowing it was designed. Famously in his book, Dawkins says that as we look around at the results of evolution, according to him, they appear designed, but they're really not. And even though they appear designed, he spent the rest of the book explaining why that wasn't true, even though they appeared designed, because he can't handle this. Now, here's a fundamental question: can design be detected? We looked at a watch. We said, yeah, that's designed. We looked at Mount Rushmore. We said that's designed. Can we do that in general? Well, in fact, there's a secular effort called SETI. It's called the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence. You might have heard about it. These are people that look at the sky and they look at all sorts of signals coming in, and what they want to do is they want to figure out if there's any intelligence in those signals. In other words, were those signals designed? And this was actually taken by Carl Sagan. Next slide. Carl Sagan, how many remember Carl Sagan? Can you do his imitation of billions and billions? Anybody do that better than I can?
No.
No. So that was pretty good then, right? Okay. Billions and billions. And he wrote a book based on that there was an intelligent design signal that came in from outer space, and he wrote a book, and they made it into a movie starring Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey. And how did they detect that there was intelligence out in space? I mean, how could you communicate intelligence? You couldn't write something in English. You couldn't send Morse code. You couldn't send some sort of amplitude modulated version of somebody talking. It has to be in a universal language. And Sagan assumed that this universal language was math. And so what happened was that they got a sequence of 26 prime numbers. Prime numbers are numbers which are only divisible by themselves in one. And they're really kind of weird. They appear very sporadically on the number line, and really take intelligence to define, according to Sagan. And they saw these 26 prime numbers, and they said, this is a message from an extra universe. So 26 prime numbers was evidence enough for them to think there was an intelligent cause. But what do we say, 1,000 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica and our DNA is not enough evidence to show that we're designed. Kind of an impasse there. So anyway, it was a fun movie until they started to get weird near the end. Anybody seen the movie?
Oh, yeah.
What'd you think of it?
I liked it,
Did you?
but the end was a little strange.
Yeah, the end was really strange when she went through the little
Yeah.
bubble. Yeah, that was just too much. Well, with that, let's look at design by Darwinism and gradual changes. This was a criteria that Darwin put forth. You can see the picture of him here before he grew his big fluffy beard, and that was a big deal. Was gradual changes, and we're going to go through some of the different challenges of intelligent design that there are. Richard Dawkins wrote another book called Climbing Mount Improbable. And you can see there on the left is a cliff, and the bottom is no information, and the top's supposed to correspond to the complexity that you and I have right now. And how do we get from the bottom to the top if we weren't created? How did we get from this big leap from nothingness into a human form? And Darwin said, or not Darwin, but Dawkins said, if you go around back the hill, there's a bunch of steps. And these steps allow you to go up and get the top of the mountain. And these steps are little, they're small, and they're manageable. So that's the idea of climbing Mount Improbable. And of course, he was talking about evolution. Small changes happening in order to get you to the top.
I can't.
Okay, this is a scene in What About Bob? You remember Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss, right?
I can help. Yes. Okay.
Bob, there is a groundbreaking new book that has just come out. Now, not everything in this book, of course, applies to you, but I'm sure that you can see, when you see the title, exactly how it could help.
Baby steps?
It means setting small, reasonable goals for yourself, one day at a time. One tiny step at a time.
Baby steps.
For instance, when you leave this office, don't think about everything you have to do in order to get out of the building. Just think of what you must do to get out of this room. And when you get to the hall, deal with that hall, and so forth. You see?
Baby steps.
Baby steps.
Oh, boy. Baby steps. Baby steps. Baby steps through the office. Baby steps out the door. It works. It works. All I have to do is take one little step at a time, and I can do anything. Baby step around the office. Baby step around the office.
That should give you a lot to digest while I'm on vacation.
So it sounded kind of like he was endorsing Mountain Probable, right? You take a little step at a time, you can do just about anything. So I thought that was very nicely correlated with Mountain Probable. Little baby steps. Okay. Now, let's look at, okay, there's what about Bob. The objection to evolution is pretty well sustained, and that's what we're going to talk about now. I'm going to show you some challenges to evolution, Darwinian evolution, which really haven't been explained or addressed yet. And we'll talk about all of these different values, from functional viability here on the top to suboptimal design. We'll talk about the Big Bang of biology. Do you know there was a Big Bang in biology? It's called the Cambrian explosion. Boop, all of a sudden life form appeared here on the world.
No baby steps there.
No baby steps, that's right. Adaptation versus macroevolution. We're talked about microevolution as little things happening, but from an engineer's perspective and coming from somebody that actually designs stuff for a living, I know that good adaptation is a good feature of design. When I design something, I want it to be adaptable to the environment or whatever contingencies might arise. Irreducible complexity, famously put forward by Michael Behe. The problem with mutations, this is interesting, we don't mutate our babies on purpose, do we? Why not? There's a chance that they could become a super person, right? But we don't take that risk. Yet there's fiction like the X-Men and what are some of these other humans? There's a bunch of TV series that actually have mutations of people that have superpowers now.
One of them calls them metahumans.
Metahumans. Very good. What show is that? Do you know?
I don't remember.
Okay. So that is a big problem with mutations. Genetic entropy. I mean, if we're having mutations, shouldn't we be getting worse instead of better? Vestigial leavings. This is the sort of thing that you talk about with appendices and junk DNA, and we'll talk about that. And then suboptimal design. Many of the people who criticize the design that they see in nature have never designed anything in their life, and that'll become very evident when we talk about suboptimal design. Now here we have the word A evolving into the word strains. Now each little step along the way has to be functionally viable. In this example, it must be a working word. So as we take steps up that mountain probable, every time we take a step, it has to be a functionally working organism in order for it to work. And many of the people that simulate evolution don't go into this. So you can see A goes to and, to ran, to rain, to train, to strain, to strains. each one of these steps is functionally viable in the sense it stands alone as its own word. And if we don't do this, it's not, then you cannot have a mount improbable. Here's an example from Richard Dawkins. This is from his book, The Blind Watchmaker, I think it is. He was trying to find the phrase, methinks it is like a weasel. So how much would it take to evolve this? Now, what Dawkins did is he just chose some letters at random. And when he chose the letters at random, you notice on that first line, if you look really close, a T and an S are a little bit shaded, right? Mm-hmm. And that T and the S, what is cool about that is that T and that S correspond to the correct letters for methinks it is like a weasel. So we're going to keep those. We're going to ratchet them up. Then we're going to go to the next step, and you can see probably better here. The first time the greens happen, then the greens and the yellows happen, and then the greens and the yellows and the blue happens here. And eventually, as we go along, we finally get the methinks it is like a weasel, and Dawkins uses this as an example for a simple type of evolution, how we might evolve the methinks it is like a weasel phrase. He didn't use exactly this algorithm, but it was very, very similar. Well, notice that there's no functional viability in the steps here, is there? In other words, no place along here does those gibberish of words make any sense. So there was no functional viability as we went on.
Who would ever spend their time doing this? Oh.
What about Bob?
Inquiring minds.
What about Bob? Yeah, we'll actually get into that. It's very interesting. So, okay, next slide then. Biology's Big Bang. This actually troubled Darwin during his life, in that, if you recall, there had to be gradual change. But if you look back at the evidence, it turns out that there was a short period, being 20 to 35 million years. That's short in terms of life development. And according to the fossil records, most major animal phyla appeared, as indicated by the fossil record, and they appear as they do today. And what was interesting is that there was more animals and complex life form created than there is today. So a bunch of it was created and then it went extinct right after it was created. Very, very strange stuff. Before the Cambrian explosion, most organisms were simple cells. So something happened there with biology's Big Bang. This is addressed really well in Stephen Meyer's book, Darwin's Doubt. If you want to get it, it's very readable. And it goes through the Cambrian explosion. And the title of his book is aptly named, because this was a doubt that Darwin had. How could we have gradual change when you had this big Cambrian explosion? So, well, of course, the scientists had to explain this. The atheist ones did, and there was no room for God. So a couple of scientists, Niles Eldridge and Stephen Jay Gould, came up with a fancy name, punctuated equilibrium. Now, it was a theory without substance, and it says that it was the hypothesis that evolutionary development is marked by isolated episodes of rapid speciation between long periods of stasis. In other words, there would be long times when nothing happens. And then boom, there would be something like the Cambrian explosion. Now, was there a reason given for this? Not during his time. I'm aware of some recent work that has addressed this. Anyway, the point is, you look at the building on the right-hand side, you see the door up there on the second floor? Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be the step in Dawkins' Climbing Mount Improbable that they would have to take in order to have this idea of punctuated equilibrium. So that's another objection to the Mount Improbable. The other one is adaptation versus evolving. When Darwin first went to the Galapagos Islands, he noticed the Galapagos finches had different beaks, and he thought this was necessitated by the available food supply. And he said this was indeed an example of kind of microevolution. This was an example of small changes. And of course, what he was doing was extrapolating. People see little steps and they say, okay, this is microevolution. If we do this long enough, we're going to get macroevolution. An alligator is going to turn into a hummingbird or something like that, right? So if we do it long enough, that's the case. Extrapolation is a very, very ill-conditioned assumption in the sense that, well, just like us predicting the future or prophesying about the future. Extrapolation is very, very difficult. In fact, you can show mathematically, I did some work in this about 20 years ago, you can show mathematically that when you attempt to extrapolate, it is so sensitive to a little bit of noise that if you sprinkle a little bit of noise on your data, then the extrapolation is up here. If you sprinkle a little bit of noise on your data, other noise, then your extrapolation is down here. So you change things just a little bit and your extrapolation goes out the window. Now, it has since been shown that this is not a matter of evolution, but these beaks actually can change back and forth over, a few hundred years from the same lineage, and this was just an adaptation that these finches had. And it was something that was part of their DNA, it's part of their makeup. So adaptation, as I mentioned before, is resident in good design. When I design something, I like it to be robust. I like it to be able to adapt to different environments. Now, from whence life? Here's the thing I said that kind of popped out to me. Did you ever notice that they were having according to their kinds, every winged bird according to its kind? And God said, let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures, and the wild animals according to its kind. And what does that mean? What does it mean that he created these animals according to their own kind?
We reproduce our own kind. People
They
make
reproduce
people,
their own
elephants make
kind.
elephants.
Yeah.
Yeah, an alligator could not give birth to a hummingbird. Let's see. There's difference between kinds and species. I put in this cartoon, interestingly, because there is a place in here where P.Z. Myers says, inside we're all fish. Did you know that? Did you watch the clip?
No, but I've heard that before.
Yeah, get in touch with your inner fish. Yeah, so.
Not so much.
What is that on the right? I can't make it out. Is that a fish?
It's a fish, he's on.
Yeah, it's a fish.
It's a really ugly fish.
But it has the same teeth he does. So that's the.
You're an atheist? You're an atheist?
I am definitely an atheist, yes.
Now, why are you an atheist?
Why am I an atheist? Because there is no God.
You've got the canine kind, the coyote, and the domestic dog, and there's the feline kind, which is the cats, the tiger and the kitten, and you've got humankind. So Darwin said there'd be a change of kinds over many years, so could you give me one example of observable evidence of a change of kinds?
So, for instance, the fossil record shows the common ancestors of all carnivores, that cats and dogs were once linked, once united by a common ancestor.
How long ago?
This, I believe, was like 60 million years ago.
The scientific method must be observable and repeatable. So could you give me one piece of observable evidence for Darwinian evolution?
Okay, I would point to, as one great example, is look at the genetics of the stickleback.
What's that?
So stickleback fish are a very interesting collection of species that were recently isolated after the end of the Ice Age.
What did they become?
They're various species of sticklebacks.
They stayed as fish.
Well, of course. Human beings are still fish.
Human beings are fish?
Why, yes, of course they are.
Could you give me an example of Darwinian evolution, not adaptation or speciation, but a change of kinds?
These are changes of kinds.
They're still fish.
They're distinctly different fish. For instance, I would say look at Lenski's experiments with bacteria then.
So what do the bacteria become?
The bacteria are still bacteria, of course.
That's not Darwinian evolution. To summarize, the observable evidence that you give me for Darwinian evolution is bacteria, becoming bacteria.
No, it is bacteria acquiring new metabolic capabilities.
What Darwin showed in his work on evolution and natural selection is that we don't need to invoke any supernatural force or power to account for the development of life through time on Earth.
That's not a change of kinds, is it?
It is a change. It is a change in the genetic makeup of the bacteria, which
They're
is
still bacteria.
We have thousands of examples.
Can you give me one?
I can give you thousands.
Just one. You said before that there is lots of evidence for evolution. I just want one observable evidence for Darwinian evolution.
No,
just one.
But I gave you some. You don't want.
Not some. I want one.
Wait, you don't want that.
I want one. Yes, I do. I'm pleading with people.
You asked me to tell you. You asked me to tell you when I've watched one species evolve into another. Isn't that right?
No, one kind into another. There's 14 different definitions of species. So I want a change of kind.
When you say change of kinds, do you mean the evolution of one species from another or to another? Yes, we have that in action actually in the Galapagos.
Could you give me one instance?
Yes, we have an example from a group of birds called Darwin's finches. Different species.
So there's still finches?
Well, of course there's still finches, yes.
So there's no change of kind.
What do you think of that?
I like that guy.
Now they are. This is taken from the Ray Comfort movie that I sent you on evolution versus God. I don't like putting evolution versus God. I don't think that they're in competition with each other, because evolution itself is an incredibly slippery word. And anytime you begin to talk about evolution with somebody, you have to sit down and you have to define what you mean. In other words, they will say, well, evolution, for example, antibiotics and the development of resistance to antibiotics, that's evolution. Yeah, I agree with that. But that's a microevolution. That's an adaptation, isn't it? The breeding of dogs or horses is an example. And they might be thinking of the evolution of dogs and horses. So it's important to define what evolution is before you talk about it. But this is in the YouTube video, the link that I gave you that was 38 minutes, and it's interviews of this sort with professors and students, and actually in the end they come to a very nice talking about Christ.
Is that Ray Comfort doing the interview?
Yes. Yeah.
I like the way they all just say, well, of course it's still a finch, or of course it's still a bacteria. Exactly.
No, they don't get it.
Thousands of examples. I just want one. I love that.
So, from Wundt's life, I believe that Ray Comfort, I'm not sure, but I believe he got this idea of one kind after another from the Genesis account that I gave you, where there was kind all over the place. Now, Ray Comfort is a young Earth creationist. He believes the Earth is, 8,000 years old or whatever, and of course he subscribes to that philosophy. Okay, go back to the next one. Another thing against Darwinian evolution is a concept brought up by Michael Behe in a classic book, Darwin's Black Box. If I would recommend it to you, I know you need more books to read, but Darwin's Black Box is really good. And the good thing about Darwin's Black Box is that it is readable by a layperson, but he goes into all of the biochemical things. Darwin's Black Box is, I think, on the next slide. I'm sorry.
People are playing Twister.
No, actually, look at that very carefully. They are
resting on top.
They're bent 90 degrees at the knees, and they are resting their backs on somebody else that's bent 90 degrees at the knees.
We should all do that.
And we should do that. We should do that. Absolutely.
You never get back up.
But I maintain that this is an example of irreducible complexity, because one of those people moved, boom, the whole thing falls.
Yeah.
And that's the idea of irreducible complexity, as purported by Behe, is a complex mechanism that if you remove one little piece from it, then the whole thing shatters. If this is true, or when this is true, it really puts a lot of doubt on whether that mechanism could be evolved with these little baby steps, with these little steps on the back of Mount Improbable. Yeah, the next slide is Michael Behe. Just a brilliant man. I think, as I mentioned last time, that Behe uses the idea of a mousetrap, a conventional mousetrap with a wooden base and the little spring and the little catch that you come up, and then the mounts that are screwed into the base. And his idea is that every one of those components is necessary for the mousetrap to work. And just like these people lying back on each other, if you remove one of the part, it totally becomes not only dysfunctional, but it isn't good for anything else either. It's just garbage. So the mousetrap is a very simple example of irreducible complexity. But Behe goes in his book through a number of cases where you do see irreducible complexity. One of them is the bacterial flagellum, which you can see here. You know, the bacteria have these little whip tails that propel them through the water. And these things are designed as outboard motors. They have rotors, they have stators, they have water cooling ability, universal joints and things. And I want to show you a little clip.
Michael Behe has studied several of these machines, including the flagellum, a remarkable rotary motor.
I remember the first time I looked in a biochemistry textbook and I saw a drawing of something called the bacterial flagellum with all of its parts in all of its glory. It had a propeller and the hook region and the drive shaft and the motor. And I looked at that and I said, that's an outboard motor. That's designed. You know, that's no chance assemblage of parts.
Behe's reaction was not surprising, especially when the bacterial flagellar motor is animated and magnified more than 50,000 times to display the details of its construction and operation.
Howard Berg at Harvard has labeled it the most efficient machine in the universe. These machines, some of them are running at 100,000 RPMs and are hardwired into a signal transduction or sensory mechanism so that it's getting feedback from the environment.
It's got some tail proteins which act as the propeller. When the flagellum rotates, these push against the water and therefore push the bacterium forward. And the motor uses a flow of acid from outside of the cell to the inside of the cell to power the turning.
The bacterial flagellum has 2 gears, forward and reverse, water-cooled, proton motive force. It has a stator, it has a rotor, it has a U-joint, it has a drive shaft, it has a propeller. It's not convenient that we give them these names. That's truly their function.
In all, about 40 different protein parts are required to build a flagellar motor. Half of them are constructor proteins, specialized mechanisms that assemble the flagellum's individual components. Since its discovery, biologists have tried to understand how a machine of such superb design could have arisen gradually, without foresight or plan, through the biological pathway Darwin envisioned.
Pretty impressive, huh? So, and we're finding out that the biological structure, even of the simple cell, is so incredible and magnificent, as we talked about last week, that we're fearfully and wonderfully made, as is the simple bacteria. So that's an example. Now, Behe makes the case in his book that the bacterial flagellum is irreducibly complex, in the sense if one takes any portion of this bacterial flagellum and removes it, then what's left is just junk. So it's just like those people lying on their backs. Then I think I have one more example of irreducible complexity that I ran across. You like that? Those are dominoes.
Oh my goodness. How did they do that?
Exactly. But would you agree that it was irreducibly complex, whatever it is? Yeah, you would. You remove one thing and it totally goes away.
Glue.
Maybe. You know, I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised. Now, there's also problems with mutation. what we're doing is we're looking at Darwin's idea and also Dawkins's ideas, and we're just showing they don't work. And that the reasonable assumption is to assume that there was an intelligent external force that was guiding these sort of things. It's referred to as abductive reasoning. You have something which occurs, and you go to all of the different things that might cause this to occur, and you go back and you choose the most reasonable one. And we're showing again and again and again that the Darwinian mechanism really isn't working. Another book that Michael Behe wrote was The Edge of Evolution, where he showed some fascinating things. It is also a very, very readable book. Do you like that monkey there?
Mm-hmm.
There's a real monkey like that has those big floppy noses. I don't know what they're called, but they sure look weird, don't they? It looks like there was a bad mutation somewhere in the evolution cycle, though. John Sanford is a really interesting man. He was a professor at Cornell University, and he was an inventor also. He invented something called the gene gun, and the gene gun shot genes into agricultural plants and let them grow better. And then he became very wealthy in accordance to that and retired from being a professor. He currently has the position of, I believe it's Courtesy Associate Professor at Cornell University. So he still is working, still is affiliated with Cornell. He wrote a book called Genetic Entropy and the Mystery of the Genome. And he asked the question, if we are mutating, shouldn't we be getting worse? I mean, if you are much more mutated in your cell than they were 500 years ago, we're not better off. We're kind of worse because 90%, 98 something percent of the mutations are deleterious. Mm-hmm. They make you worse off. We have so many genetic diseases today, and they didn't have those a long time ago. But according to John Sanford, we are heading towards more and more polluted gene pool, and as life progresses, we're going to become worse and worse off with these biologically inherited diseases. So we're not getting up and getting better and better and better. We're actually getting worse and worse and worse, according to Sanford. And you can read his book, and since he's a guy that knows genes, I guess he knows what he's talking about. Huh? One of the arguments for many years about the evolution was the so-called vestigial leaving of previous bouts of evolution. Michael Shermer, who I think is the president of the American Skeptics Society, which is a society of atheists, and he argues regularly on the opposite side of intelligent design, says vestigial structures stand as evidence of the mistakes, the misstarts, and especially the leftover traces of evolutionary history. As I mentioned, there has been observed adaptive loss of function. Salamanders in a cave after a few generations don't have their eyeballs anymore, for example, right? And what was the other thing we mentioned? Oh, the sickle cell anemia coming as a deterrent to malaria. But
Appendix.
yeah, I do have the appendix down here. We talked about the appendix last week. That's the last bullet there. It used to be called a large and abnormal intestine of a remote ancestor in 2012. That's the reason you can cut it out without any problems. When I was a boy, they used to cut out tonsils. I had my tonsils taken out. I remember being very angry because they told me after I had my tonsils taken out I could eat all the ice cream I wanted, but my throat was so sore I couldn't swallow anything, and it just irritated me. But now the appendix is known to assist the immune system manufacturing hormones during fetal development and provides a safe haven for flora bacteria. And you mentioned something, Joy, right?
Well,
does this cover it?
Yes, it does.
Okay. The other one I think that we mentioned last week too was junk DNA. This idea that much of the DNA that we have in our bodies was junk DNA. It was left over from previous bouts of evolution and was something that was no longer used. And recently, over the last 10 years or so, epigenetics has shown that indeed this isn't the case, that this junk DNA is important, not only important, but mandatory for the process of reproduction in the cell. And that it takes charge of a lot of the chemical sort of operations. So the vestigial leavings isn't a good criticism of design.
Bob, what you said about the salamander basically losing its eyeballs over a period of time, that's not evolution, that's devolution.
Well, yeah, it is. It's what I would refer to as loss of function.
Right.
And we do see loss of function, and by the way, that's claimed as evolution sometimes by the evolutionists. But loss of function is not indeed evolution.
Right.
I think when we think of evolution, we think of an increase in complexity. And there has to be an increase of complexity in terms of the organism.
And if there was evolution, mothers would have an extra eye on the back of their head.
Yes, that's true.
That's what we all need.
They do.
And a third arm.
We kind of think we do, but you know, really that's what would happen, not that they lose our sight.
We also see in the next page suboptimal design as a criticism. We see this by people that have never designed anything. They will look at the eyeball, for example, and say, boy, that's a stupid way to do the eyeball. You know, that actually the things go around your eyeballs and go in the back, and the image is upside down. Your brain has to twist it around. And, you know, that's just a stupid way to design things. And then they come out and they find out, well, you know, there's a reason for that. And the reason is something engineers know all about. I think that biologists don't know about it. All complex design is multi-objective. Anytime you design something, there are trade-offs which you have to experience. And I have an example here of buying a mode of transportation where your conflicting criteria are cost and safety. Safe cars aren't cheap and cheap cars aren't safe. So therefore there's a trade-off, and assuming for a specific cost, we can have a degree of safety that I'm assuming here that we can indeed measure. And you actually get this little line here, which is called the Pareto frontier in engineering. And the answer is, what's the optimal design? There is no optimal design. Any point on here is the best you can do in terms of trade-off. And you have to decide which is more important to you, the safety or the cost. And once you decide the safety and the cost, the trade-off between them, you can figure out a point on here. And what we normally do, what I do, is figure out how much I can cost, and then I maximize the safety of the car. Okay. So, but again, there is no right answer. There is no perfect design. It's just inherent in any complex design. Yes.
Didn't he go into the thing about the panda not having the fully developed thumb?
That was in the chapter, yes.
Right, and it was like that, not because it was suboptimal in terms of its design, but the fact that it could strip bamboo so much easier.
It was doing what it was meant to do.
Exactly.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to be opposable thumbs so we could get hyper-intelligence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that plus the whole vestigial leavings and the theories, it's extreme arrogance to assume that we know everything. So just because we don't know what an appendix is for, or because we don't know why a panda, why do we think that we're some kind of god and we know why it's that way, and obviously it's left over from evolution? It's the arrogance of the scientist assuming that we know all there is to know. But history has proven that wrong time and time and time and time and time again. That more things are being discovered. It amazes me that these typically gentlemen, but all scientists, seem to be so extremely arrogant.
I was actually taught in the 70s in my science class that the professor believed there was no God because of the appendix and the tonsils. He said it showed that it was, had to be just chance and randomness because those things were not needed in the body.
I think we went over last week all of the things in history about science that have been wrong. And why do they think now all of a sudden they have it right? The head of the patent office at the turn of the from the 19th, 20th century says we might as well close down the patent office because everything that can be discovered has been discovered. I mean, that was one of the big snafus of history.